So with this, we are ready for our next talk. And the next panel is about discussing social impact at scale. So we have three amazing people here, Marcus from Klima, Raphaël from Toucan, and Scott from Gitcoin. And we're going to kind of cover a lot of things that we want to talk about on how we think we can spend our time and resources as developers or as users in Web3 to sort of make all of this more impactful for the space. So I want to welcome all of you here. I want to start off by asking the first question, which is I'd love for everybody to kind of get to know who you are, what you do, and sort of how you got into this space. And we can start with Scott, and we can go to Marcus. But Scott, welcome, and ready to take over.
Awesome. Yeah, Kartik, thank you so much. And I'm just excited to see this topic being discussed now actively in the space, honestly. It's been kind of a wild few years on the Gitcoin side where we sort of started as a community of I guess just software developers looking to grow and sustain public goods in sort of the open source software, digital public goods space. And I think what we're kind of seeing now is honestly just a complete evolution of that into this regenerative finance movement. And that's honestly been sort of my mission in the space since I started in the space. So it's sort of in a sense, like a dream for me that this is happening. And I think that, what I'm hoping will happen in the future is just really getting more of these sorts of conversations happening across the space. But my real background is kind of boring. I did machine learning back in 2015, kind of got into DAOs in 2015-16. The DAO hack happened. So there was a period there where no one really wanted to talk about DAOs for a while. But then I joined Gitcoin as a co-founder with Kevin in 2017, 2018. And that's sort of like the little bit of a backstory of that whole journey. But yeah, I'm just super excited to see this sort of evolution. And I'll pause there just because I feel like we have a lot to discuss on that topic later.
Absolutely. Marcus, would love to kind of get a bit of intro on yourself as well as Klima.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kartik, for having us, and to the LFGrow community. Welcome from Klima DAO. Glad to be here. So ultimately, Klima is trying to bring the voluntary carbon markets on chain and create a regenerative economy where the fundamental asset of economic activity is tied to environmental services, in particular, the mitigation of carbon emissions. I personally came into the space around the time that Klima launched, a little before. My background is in data science and data engineering. I've been working in the Web 2 world for about 6 or 7 years. I first started learning about crypto personal investment a couple of years ago, took the deep dive into DeFi over the last year or so. And when I found Klima, it all kind of clicked, and I was excited to bring my data skill set to bear on this exciting new space of refi.
Amazing. And Raphaël, last but not least, we'd love to learn more about yourself too.
Sure. Yeah, I'm super excited to be here because actually this is a big flashback for me. I've been at East London. I don't know if you remember, Kartik.
Absolutely do.
I was sitting in the audience watching you speak. And so yeah, Toucan, which was still called CO Toucan 2 years ago. Essentially, like our goal is to build technology that can put climate action at the heart of every financial transaction. And we realized that the fastest path towards doing this is to bring carbon on chain as a money Lego or as a building block for others to build on, right? And yeah, Marcus is here, Klima DAO obviously being the most important protocol right now that is building on Toucan, and hopefully, one of many protocols that can unlock what we now call refi. Yeah, I'm really happy how this term refi came together. I remember, I think like 2 years ago, we tried to term the coin DCLFI for decentralized climate finance, but refi is just so much more elegant. So yeah, I'll stop here. But yeah, like I'm excited to be here, and this is a little bit nostalgic for me.
We're super excited to have you too. I think it's this is one of my favorite parts here, which is anytime somebody who kind of comes in at the hackathon and sort of ends up pursuing their projects to be more than just a hackathon project and sort of comes back and gives back to the community. That is a perfect cycle moment for us and just a global team. And it's just wonderful to kind of have these experiences. And interestingly, we've had this happen for every single event we've done in the past 6 months, and it just blows my mind that this is a thing. So I'm beyond excited to see this. So I think you kind of brought up a lot of interesting points already, because this sets up the theme for what we want to discuss next. Starting with you, Raphaël, would love to kind of understand, like, what does it mean to regen for you, and kind of why do you think it's important? Obviously, there's a bias here, but we'd love to kind of still get that answer from each of you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, actually. So for me, the main problem that we have right now is, climate change is a huge coordination failure. And when I first looked at this problem 2 years ago, I was also coming from the DAO perspective, and I was like, cool, we have these amazing coordination tools, smart contracts are great at that, and we have this huge coordination failure. How can we, put the two together? And for me, probably being a regen is applying some degen blood towards a regenerative cause. So it's, let's try things, let's experiment, let's move quickly. Really, like, one of the key theses, no, it's probably not the right word, but you know what I want to say, behind Toucan is we want to put the mind share and like just the innovative power behind Web3 on to work on the biggest problem that we have as a human, or as a species. So yeah, for me, being a regen means trying out, failing, experiment, and see where where it leads us. And honestly, climate change is a money problem also, right? Like, in both that we need to allocate huge amounts of money and other resources towards solving the climate crisis. But interestingly, money is also potentially part of a solution, which I'm sure Marcus can talk more about. So yeah, I'll stop here.
We can jump right into Marcus. Marcus, what does it mean to be a regen for you, and why is it important for you?
Yeah, so to me, the real difference between a degen and a regen, it comes back to like the structure of economic systems. So I think often, well, historically, externalities have been a way to get ahead in the capitalist system, right? You can basically get something for free by polluting, or taking water from a public source, or yeah, basically externalities are a major problem for traditional capitalist systems, and refi represents this idea, an opportunity to create financial systems, create economic systems where incentives are aligned, where the long-term health of the ecosystem is priced in to the cost of doing business. And the hard part, though, of course, is that, as Rafa said, there's money on the line, right? Because there's obviously, when you internalize an externality, that incurs a cost. And I think until very recently, in the legacy, corporate world, the cost of addressing the externality of pollution, as an example, of carbon emissions, has not been, the cost of addressing that has not been justified. There wasn't social pressure, there wasn't a feeling of urgency. I mean, the case of the major fossil fuel companies basically covering up the science on global warming is pretty damning evidence on that front. But there's now this opportunity to turn that narrative around, right? To, for instance, one of the things that I think is really, I think there's an opportunity to create collaboration where there once was competition. And that's what refi ultimately means to me.
That's an incredible answer, and I'll just let Scott jump in too.
Yeah, I definitely think the positive externality piece is at the heart of pretty much everything we're talking about here, because, and actually I would really credit Toby, Shorin, and the other internet crew for writing a really great piece on this Positive Sum Worlds, which kind of highlights the fact that what we're building, and actually what DAOs are able to kind of produce, is kind of a club model, or a commons model, depending on how you frame it, which allows for positive externalities to actually be produced kind of as a side effect. And I think that that's something that previously was very difficult to extend. So if you look back to like Ostrom's commons model rather, in sort of like that framing, the problem is really that you have local resources which are kind of scarce, and you need a way to manage them. You need a way to ensure that people are using them effectively. And what Hardin, sort of in opposition to Ostrom, was originally stating was that you would effectively end up with this tragedy of the commons where you would never be able to do that effectively. You would always end up with basically someone defecting, deciding just to go off on their own and not really work with the group. And Ostrom was able to show at local scale that you can actually do that pretty effectively. And there's many cases in which that's happened. But in a global context, it's very easy to pass on externalities. Very easy, like as Marcus mentioned, just it's very easy to pass off pretty much everything that is, not useful to you as a company or as even a government to some other external party. And so with climate change, you see this most prominently, but it's also true with things like open source software, with things like even, right now, as we're seeing with some of the crises that are happening with things like peace, it's very difficult to get people just on a global scale to coordinate. And I think what's interesting is this idea effectively of, public goods on the one hand, but also global common sort of management, which is enabled by these DAO structures. So that to me is really the sort of like the positive externality piece of that is at the heart of why we can actually basically enable these kinds of solutions today in ways we couldn't before. So that's a bit of a TLDR.
No, it's really good framing too, because that is fundamentally, I like the fact that you're looking at measuring the impact and not just the process. And that's kind of a good way to think about this, because otherwise you don't make progress. And so I think, I feel like one thing I missed asking, which I should have done before this question, is actually giving the audience a better understanding of what each of you actually do in terms of what the protocol does or what the company does. So there's obviously a big climate heavy focus on this panel in terms of 2 out of 3 of you are on that problem, but Gitcoin specifically is a really good public goods sort of solution and company out there. So I'd love to start with you, Scott, and then learn more about Toucan and Klima, and just kind of go into what is it the platform does, how do you do it, some of the impact that you can kind of talk about, and just how do things work behind the scenes and under the hood. So let's start with Gitcoin, and then we can go to Klima and Toucan.
Awesome. We've, principally been focused on quadratic funding, which is a lot to really get into, but in short, it's really a democratic way to crowdfund contributions in a way that kind of allows for a community to signal its preferences according to the will of sort of the poor and the many versus the rich and the few. So you could imagine if you have 20 grantees, which actually we do right now, sort of have we are around going for grants round 13, where you can see this in action. But the idea essentially is that over a 2-week period, let's say, you get a sense of what the community is signaling, and you use this method, which actually was created by Glenn Wales, Zoe Hitsagen, Vitalik, to effectively distribute a pool of matching funds from larger players in the ecosystem. So in the end, you end up with kind of a preference ordering for a given set of public goods within a specific community context. And you can almost imagine those communities as kind of their own commons, right? So, someone like a group like Polygon, or a group like Aave, or a group like, anyone else who's kind of got their own ecosystem could, kind of curate and decide on what they care about and what public goods they want to fund in the context of their own ecosystems. But the beauty is that those end up actually themselves creating positive externalities because it's all open source software. So that's kind of the TLDR of just, what we're aiming to do with the tooling that we have. And we've started to, like, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, expand on this notion in the context of, things like climate, we have a climate round going now, and things like longevity, human health, peace in the case of funding in the case of Ukraine. And ultimately, those are, to me, exactly as Rafa kind of mentioned, the problems that I think are just missing solutions in the context of, existing institutions. And so, we're kind of broad in terms of what we focus on in terms of impact. Open source software was the start, but I think there is this broader recognition in the community over the last few years that there really is a potential for us to actually bring this impact back to the physical world, which, of course, everything that we're doing relies on.
Amazing. Marcus, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I have to say, though, I think it might be easier to understand what Klima is after Toucan explains how they bring carbon on chain.
Sure.
There we go.
Yeah, cool. So Toucan really at the core is a way to connect the Web 2 carbon market with Web 3, right? So there's a bunch of small modules to it. The first one being the carbon bridge. So essentially, this is a way to connect to what we call source registries. So what's important to know is that we only bring credits on chain that are verified by nonprofits and so-called carbon standards in the real world. So we're not like the auditing body. We're really just like technology infrastructure that allows anybody that holds these credits today to move them on chain. And so on the other side of, when you use the Carbon Bridge as a user, you get so-called TCO2 tokens, which are project-specific carbon tokens. So that's important because they carry all the metadata and attributes that are relevant, because carbon is a very diverse asset. Actually, like carbon credits, can be generated by planting trees, by protecting trees, by having solar energy, or like direct air capture. So it's like a really broad field of use cases that can produce carbon credits, right? And so we want to make sure that all this data is represented. And then now you can think of credits like a semi-fungible, carbon credits like semi-fungible. So what we want to do is that we want to create some commoditization and harmonization to this asset class based on like logical, like homogeneous groups. And so a good example, for instance, is the Nature Carbon Ton, which we launched a couple of weeks ago, which essentially is like a pool where you can deposit nature-based TCO2 tokens or nature-based carbon credits into the pool, as long as they match these criteria. So you can think of it like I'm from Berlin, so you can think of it like a club that has a bouncer and it only allows certain types of carbon credits to go into the club. And what you get on the other side is what we call a carbon reference token. So in that case, it's NCT, the Nature Carbon Ton, and that now has obviously much deeper liquidity, and it has more like it behaves more like a commodity, right? And so right now there's NCT, the Nature Carbon Ton, and BCT, which was developed together with KlimaDAO back in October to serve their theory of change of moving the price floor up for carbon. And the main idea, or like the main thing that we want to unlock is the builders kind of using these building blocks to create, novel applications. And this is why I'm excited to see what comes out of this hackathon also. And so there's also a token bounty, by the way. So building with carbon and social graphs. I think I'm excited to see what comes out of it.
Cool. I'll go ahead. So thanks for setting that up, Rafa. So as Rafa was describing, carbon credits themselves are sort of like a commodity, but they're heterogeneous. And what Toucan's done is brought them on chain. This sort of legacy Web 2 financial instrument essentially brought them on chain and made them into a tradable asset, an ERC20. But that's not really, that's sort of like the beginning of a DeFi protocol rather than the end, right? Because there's the market that needs to be created. If we use an analogy here to like a sort of antiquated concept of like rail travel, so there's someone has to build the rails, and then there's a set of cars that carry some commodity on those rails, right? If Toucan is like building the cars and putting, allowing people to put their tonnage into the cars, Klima is trying to own the rails. So we're establishing and holding long-term liquidity for carbon assets on chain. We started out with Toucan's BCT. We since added MCO2 into our sort of liquidity rail ecosystem. And the idea is that the Klima token is sort of the reserve currency of this new on-chain carbon market, where if you want to acquire BCT, if you want to acquire NCT, if you want to acquire MCO2 or any other carbon assets that come online, Klima is your medium of exchange, right? And the reason why Klima has been structured, the tokenomics have been structured in such a way that the supply of Klima is tied to the amount of carbon held in KlimaDAO's treasury. So basically, there's a liquidity flywheel inspired by the Olympus protocol, where Klima is minted and issued in return for bonders bringing an asset to the treasury. So that whole Olympus protocol stuff is quite complicated, honestly, but a good analogy to have in your head when you're thinking about Olympus-style protocols is the Federal Reserve System, which I understand many people may not be familiar with that system, but the basic idea is you have some treasury of assets. Like in the old days, it was gold and silver would be held in the Federal Reserve, and then dollars would be printed where each dollar is backed by some amount of gold in the treasury. So Klima is very similar. The Klima token, in order to issue one Klima, we have to hold at least 1 ton of carbon offsets in the treasury. that's sort of like the top level. But if I step back and like think about what is Klima trying to do, ultimately we are trying to create an economy on chain where the fundamental asset in that economy is carbon offsets, or really more generally, any kind of environmental service that can be tokenized. So starting with carbon offsets makes a lot of sense because they're an established market. They've been around for about 20 years and there's already existing demand. But one of the things we're really excited about moving forward is the opportunity to create an economy where, as a supplier even, you could potentially perform some service, right? Whether that's planting trees or switching to solar renewable energy, but to create an economy where anyone can participate as a supplier of some ecosystem service and as a consumer of the tokenized versions of those environmental services. To be a little more clear about like what I'm actually talking about, carbon offsets are one way of financializing an ecosystem service. Another idea would be something like an ocean cleanup credit. Or a wetland restoration credit. Now, the hard part right now is this is a very immature industry and there aren't great methodologies for those more specific types of environmental services. So we're sort of starting with carbon offsets as a simple, already existing environmental service that can be tokenized. But the goal really is to create an economy that incentivizes preservation of our planet rather than destruction of the planet.
Super insightful. This is amazing, and I love kind of the scope of the impact, which is you finally get to work at problems at scale with the help of anybody who wants to be part of these communities, and it's a really unique thing that I think we've seen in Web3. There's a common theme that's been touched on here, and Marcus, you just kind of highlighted that you kind of pointed out that the carbon credit markets have been around for a couple of decades already, and everybody has kind of been talking about these things for a long time in general. I guess from each of your perspectives, and maybe we can start with Scott here, like what do you think has changed over the last couple of years that have sort of created this surge in everybody wanting to focus more on impact or refi, and kind of what do you think the factors have been that sort of sparked this?
I think honestly, like kind of what Marcus mentioned, the tooling is just there now where it wasn't before in a lot of ways. There just wasn't really an easy way to, even in 2017, 2018, the idea of, even though many people were building kind of products at that time, the idea of having users at scale doing this sort of work was like kind of unlikely. And now we've realized that actually that's really not even the model that you want to think about. You really want to think about building entire kind of like collective communities, almost like effectively creator collectives in which these kind of actions can take place. And that generally speaking, most people are actually very interested in doing this because you look at how the traditional economy has run over the last even 5-10 years, it's generally not been very good for the average person. And I think that ultimately people are just looking for ways to find more meaning in the work that they're doing. There's some great thinkers on this topic, actually, including Ivan Illich, who I would highlight just as one that folks can probably check out later. It's too much to get into here. But I think that ultimately that search for sort of really finding solutions to the problems that we're facing is something that just naturally has almost taken shape in the context of a more absurdist postmodern society that we're in. The other last thing I'll just note is I think, from my perspective, I think that people ultimately just learned a lot over the pandemic about how much we can coordinate globally in ways that were just not possible, or really, as I mentioned, like the tools weren't there for before. And so I think there's also been, in light of all these things, a kind of cultural, social shift. But the details of those things are like way too much to go into. I'm sure Raphaël, Marcus can dive in a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, what you said is just jumping on it. Like, I think we're just in like very turbulent times. Like, I live in Europe, and Europe is like, I have war really close to me, and like that's just one example. But I think in general, as like a human, at human level, we're kind of in a transition phase, it feels, right? And it's very clear that the model that we thought was working, hyper growth, etc., globalization, like we just looked at the bright side, and we completely ignored some of, that we were basically destroying the basis of life. And so it's just so clear, but it's really hard to get out of that, right? It's like it's like we're like addicted to growth, and we're and also on like the personal level, right? Like it's just everybody's like, why should I, why should I give up my car? So like it's a really fundamental problem. And I think what has changed, so I remember 2 years ago when I talked about crypto and carbon, like nobody cared. But like also in crypto, I think the tone has shifted, right? It's kind of like an industry which now has, like there's been a lot of criticism actually about the environmental footprint also of crypto. I think that has actually played like the NFT hype, which has been, bringing a completely new set of users actually to Web3 that were maybe more climate conscious, has, I think, done a lot of good for this climate and refi movement, and kind of opened the door. But generally, I think, as Scott was saying, like people love to work on something that is meaningful. And now you can actually work in the most fascinating industry of the world and do something meaningful. Like, so, I think it's that plays into it. It's just like, yeah, doing something meaningful can be fun, and people, because of this transitionary phase, are willing to think outside of the box, right? Something like Klimata would just not have been possible, even if it, I think, was even if the technology was there like 10 years ago. I don't think like people were ready to rethink money at that scale, right? And what crypto has done is that it made reinventing money really easy, and this just opens up a new playing field. And so yeah, I guess it's just interesting times, and like turbulent times are always interesting times, and that's where kind of major shifts happen.
Yeah, I think just speaking from my personal experience, relatively new to the Web3 space, and was really inspired by Klima to drop my meat space job and go full time. Basically, as Rafa was saying, to take this opportunity that isn't presented very often to work on something meaningful and, on cutting edge technology. So I do think there's a sense that like the pressure to do something, at least in like the climate space specifically, has been growing and growing. And public consciousness does seem to have shifted in the last couple of years, to the point where like corporates are under extreme pressure, to have ESG plans. And like the mainstream public is fed up with inaction on this issue specifically, I think. The other thing I will say though is I do think there's been some important innovation in DeFi specifically that has unlocked some of these new economic systems that weren't really practical before. Like I know that some of the early Klima founders had kind of an idea for this concept of like a new money system built with carbon as the backing, but the idea of like a on-chain treasury managed using a bonding mechanism similar to the Federal Reserve was really hadn't been implemented until Olympus came around. And so it's really these Lego blocks that have been created that now allow us to build more sophisticated structures that enable refi to exist as such.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, this was exactly my next question, which is a lot of that from a timing standpoint is also because you have now an abstraction that just previously wasn't there, or we just hadn't figured out how do we actually enable certain things to exist in a simple way. Aside from what you just said, Marcus, what else is kind of just enabled by blockchains here that sort of helps you accomplish the goals for each of your companies?
Yeah, in the carbon space specifically, there's a huge opportunity because the legacy carbon market is pretty antiquated, to use a nice term. So there's a huge lack of transparency. Most of these deals are done in back rooms, behind closed doors. Pricing data is not public. So like most transactions are not, you don't know how much people like Microsoft and Amazon are paying for the tons they're acquiring. So there's a level of transparency just at a pure like financial level that the blockchain brings that is right now absent from the legacy markets, at least in the carbon offset space. So that's a big opportunity. The other thing I would say is that the sort of interoperability aspect is really promising because, in the old world, if you want to retire your carbon credits, if you want to claim them, it's like a manual process. Like you're talking like spreadsheets and email level of technology. And so if you wanted to automate offsetting, that is like not really practical to do. Some, larger entities have set up API connections and stuff, but it's not practical for a small project to offset automatically. Whereas on chain, it's just a contract call. So that level of abstraction has really created the opportunity to create an ecosystem rather than a series of like walled gardens where you have to go through like a Web2 centralized authority to offset your carbon.
Yeah, just like jumping on that, carbon credits really are packaged positive externalities, right? Like somebody's going out, is doing something, and somebody else is verifying that like there has been like a state change essentially, right? So let's from no trees to trees, right? And the delta in that state change is then given out in terms of carbon credits. But so it's a carbon credit really is a bunch of data and signatures, and right now a lot of PDF documents that are kind of packaged together, right? So, but ultimately we're dealing with like an intangible asset that is, you can see it, you can smell it. And so I personally think that environmental markets are like, this might be the killer use case for blockchains, right? Or it's definitely, I believe it's definitely one of them, right? Because the integrity of that process is so important. And because, and just adding on top of what Marcus has been saying is now like every jurisdiction now is trying to figure out how do we address climate change. And so there's a bunch of different carbon markets actually, right? Like we talk about the carbon market as if it was one thing. When we talk about the carbon market, actually we talk about the voluntary carbon market right now, but there's like a compliance carbon market, and that one is, is different for Colombia than it is for the US than for Europe. So everybody's like doing a little bit of their own thing. And then we have these credits, and some of these are accepted in one jurisdiction and not in another. So like we believe that having that like, neutral piece of infrastructure, that's what we call the Meta Registry, that everybody can issue on and that everybody can retire, and like everybody, can do so programmatically. This can actually unlock a much more homogeneous global carbon market that I think we need to have in order to address this at scale, because climate change is a global problem, and doing regulation on a like local level, I don't think it's going to cut it. So yeah, I'll stop there. But I'm really like, actually my conviction grows by every day. My conviction grows that, 2 years ago, I thought crypto might be a good market to sell carbon into. And now like in the last few years, I realized, no, it's actually like we're now kind of leapfrogging from Web 1 directly into Web 3 carbon markets, basically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was just say, Scott, I know this is maybe not 100% overlapping, but I'm sure there's an answer for Gitcoin and giving out grants too. So we'd love for you to share more thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's pretty simple, which is like again, like 3 years ago, 5 years ago, DAOs were not really a topic that were very popular. And I think that the idea of DAOs are a nebulous term, but really what we're talking about, like when I talk about them, at least what I'm trying to kind of get at is the idea of these global internet native organizations, and almost like kind of, commons based organizations that, to Rafa's point, have the ability to create their own currencies and govern themselves according to their own rules. And really all that we're doing with the tooling that we have with Quadratic Funding and so forth is providing a rail for them to basically figure out what their preferences are, how they should prioritize what they're funding, and in a way that effectively allows them to build things that create positive externalities. I just think that really, we did that for so long with mostly the support of the Ethereum Foundation. And now there's just hundreds of orgs that want to do the same thing and are kind of leaning on a lot of the principles that folks like actually Aya and Vitalik put together, like the subtraction mindset sort of principles from that side of the space. And that to me is really just at the heart of everything that we're doing.
I think one thing that we sort of, in a way, acknowledged but didn't touch on specifically is, I think all three of you are in an industry that is that has a proxy for like the enterprise side, or just the legacy world also is a pretty big player. And kind of my question, so I have a two-part question here. So the first piece here is for the current non-blockchain solution that's out there for the problem you're solving, what does that kind of look like in terms of the partners that you have to work with, their reactions about the technology, or what do you have to do to convince them to actually think about these things or accept your solution as one of the other integrations? Like, what does that look like? And similar to kind of on that theme, what has been anywhere from challenging to the still stuff that you have to do behind the scenes that interacts with the real world, especially for a lot of the stuff around carbon credits. I assume it's not just a software only problem. It'll be silly to think so. So what kind of goes on behind the scenes? What are those conversations like? What are the challenges there? And kind of how do you think about that part of the world also now adopting to the newer solutions?
Yeah, so Klima has a bit of an interesting positioning here because we're ultimately aiming to be a credibly neutral market facilitator, right? We want to work with everybody basically, and so that gives us an opportunity, but also a challenge, because the opportunity is we are able to interface with standards bodies. We're able to interface with legacy carbon players and sort of get feedback from them, get input from them. But when it comes to actually bringing consumers of credits on chain, there's definitely a dichotomy between the sort of legacy consumers who are already operating in the market, already have expertise in how to offset, versus the entities that maybe want to be doing that, but don't have the resources or the funding to do that. So that's kind of where we've been starting in terms of our outreach. We have a partnership program called Klima Infinity, where we're basically working with enterprises, partnering with enterprises and protocols to offset their emissions. It's kind of similar to a consulting model that many legacy carbon brokers employ, where they'll be hired, for a few $100,000 to calculate the emissions and handle all the offsetting activity. So what we found is that we basically, for the legacy consumers, we need to fit into their box. We need to kind of show them that there really isn't that big of a difference between consuming on chain and consuming in the legacy world, at least in terms of the underlying, legitimacy and quality of the credits. So there's definitely a FUD aspect where, people who are experienced in the legacy market want to throw shade at tokenized carbon, either from lack of understanding or because they feel threatened. So I'd say that's our biggest challenge, is trying to keep everyone free, trying to keep everyone realizing that there's a positive sum outcome. It's better for everyone to move the market on chain, especially in the light of legacy players whose business model is potentially being disrupted.
Yeah, I think you're mentioning a good point there, is that I think it's a mixture of curiosity and fear for the legacy carbon market. But in general, I think the curiosity is winning. And this is because it's a market that historically, the volunteer carbon market historically has been a very small market, and it's been mostly driven by NGOs and few corporate customers. But there's a new wave. The customers of the last 20 years are not the same as the corporates that are buying today, right? Microsoft and BlackRock, etc. They were carbon offsets were not that big of their agenda 10 years ago. And so the carbon market is now in a phase where the demand side is much more demanding also in what they want to see, right? So they're asking for more data driven, they're asking for more transparency in the process, etc. So we kind of have a market that didn't have the time to adapt to its kind of popularity. And so curiosity, I would say, is definitely winning, because people understand that they need to innovate. They need to adopt digital technologies, and why not go all the way? So so also just adding is that the carbon market also has been a place of fraud historically. There have been incidents of fraud back in 2010 and 2008, etc. So there's this fear with regards to crypto that it's just a bunch of cowboys that are now trying to fraud people, and so I think this adds to that. The fact that there has been fraud historically adds to the skepticism, but yeah, generally I would say it's the curiosity is definitely winning, and I have no doubt that we too can definitely pay a lot of attention to make sure that the tokens themselves are linked directly to the off-chain asset, and that it's a two-way link basically. So if somebody takes the time to actually look how that is created, it's really hard to say that to not understand what's going on basically.
Also, interestingly, the answer to the fraud situation problem is being actually digital and having traceability. So
Yeah.
It should.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Scott, I also want to make sure that you get a chance to comment on this as well.
Yeah, I think actually it's funny, the fraud piece is particularly relevant for us because really, what we're trying to do is figure out ways to, in a credibly neutral way, but also in a way that is sort of ensuring, legitimacy of the donations, measure the impact that's being made in a way that wasn't really possible in a lot of, I would say not most, but like a large portion of Web2 philanthropic initiatives. And I think there's a problem right now of mostly people similar to the realizations we mentioned before in the context of other parts of sort of the economy. But there's a realization that a lot of these large, foundations, which have lots of money, don't have a lot of transparency into how they're sort of, spending that funding. And I think that ultimately what we're realizing is that in a lot of those cases, using these tools, whether it's quadratic funding or whether it's, there's a lot of really cool work happening around the conviction voting and conviction related funding too. There's retroactive funding, which Optimism's doing some amazing work on. All of those tools give us new ways to basically deploy funding that just weren't really there before and that weren't really nearly as transparent, I think, as they can be now.
And I kind of also want to get to kind of wrapping this up. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So kind of the final question is like, obviously we kind of talked about how these things are sort of being done right now and kind of the individual standalone impact that all of these solutions would have. I think what's interesting here and kind of also why this is part of the actual LFGrow Summit is that there are still more amplified and exponential benefits of this being part of a larger network, whether it's from a graph or just being able to port anywhere from your history or background to other solutions out there, whether it's on the DeFi side or other social networks or any other on-chain activity. So kind of from each of your perspective, how do you kind of think that having just sort of a notion of a decentralized graph of everybody's impact or activity would amplify a refi, like looking at just kind of lens altogether or your wish list of all of this? How can we make that better for refi?
Yeah, I just want to reference a book that is very inspiring for KlimaDAO and kind of ties into this question. It's called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And one of the really cool aspects of that is that basically in the book, a decentralized social network is the driver of mass adoption of crypto and the use of a carbon-backed currency to basically save the planet from climate change. So I think there's a really exciting opportunity here to leverage like social pressure, essentially social proof, right? Like you can show your friends, your colleagues that you've taken, you put your money where your mouth is. So one of the ideas we're really excited about is this notion of like a green check, right? So by basically going through some verifiable on-chain process, you can attest that you have, made a pledge of like what you think your emissions are, publish that pledge, and then, showing that you on-chain offset that tonnage to, meet your pledge. And then you get a little check, a little social proof that you have actually done this action, and you can share that with your network.
Yeah, I would agree. I think this is one of the key missing components, right? So it all comes back like, climate action is something like, why do we do that, right? Like, I live in Berlin. I've lots of friends who are very conscious of these things. And I think actually, and I've learned a lot about like environmentalism from my friends. So from my peers essentially. And I see other doing a behavior and actually I might copy it. So I think that this, this is how humans work, and having this ported into the virtual space, which we spend more and more time in, the metaverse essentially, and porting that into the metaverse and allowing, people to express themselves and to show like the impact that they have, actually creates a new currency, right, which is status, and which creates new incentives ultimately for people to do the right thing. Because we know from behavioral science that people, like, if nobody sees you, like, people do pretty horrible stuff, right? But if other people are looking, people start to behave in a much more 3-3 positive sum way. So I'm super excited about that component being brought on chain. And yeah, like as I said earlier, I can't wait to see like what comes out of it. And like not just out of this hackathon, but we've been in conversations, and I really want to make sure that this is deeply integrated into kind of the climate positive, and not just climate. Like climate is just one problem that we need to solve. It's not it's just it's not everything. So yeah, I'm really stoked, and I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting ideas around like almost a regen score. And that's actually been something that we've seen play out in previous rounds on Bitcoin, where people effectively end up donating to projects and they end up with actually real rewards as a result of that from, projects that end up kind of graduating and going and doing their own thing and then giving back to the community that supported them. I think in addition, though, there's this kind of question of, on the one hand, there's incentives for like extrinsically motivating people to do the work that they should be doing. There's also the idea of, and this is true in open source software, and I think it's just a really important point to hit home, is there's people who are also really already intrinsically motivated to do things, but don't actually have the financial means to do them. And I think that it's often, historically in open source software, and I think this is true in the case of, the climate space and other sort of like global commons as well, there's this problem of just generally people not being willing to, not necessarily, sorry, that they're willing to, but they're not necessarily able to take the time to do the work that they want to do. And I think that's actually, kind of going back to our previous conversation where there's just this mass sort of realization that, wait, like the collective hallucination that we had before doesn't necessarily, align with our values. And now we have, all these tools to sort of allow that intrinsic motivation to shine through. So I might be overly optimistic about the natural state of things, but I think that's a really key piece.
Yeah, optimism is important in order to stand up in the morning. So.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think one kind of cool piece about this thing is that, especially at a hackathon, you get to try all these possibilities at a smaller scale and just see what resonates or what actually the impact could be, and use that as a proxy to decide what direction you should choose or go in more on. So yeah, I'm super excited to see seeing a couple of interesting carbon offset use cases with new social networks that come out of this hackathon, and everything that you said, Scott, I think makes absolute sense. Yeah, this is very much needed, and I'm glad that people are now actually thinking about this thing as a priority and not just as a side thing that they should signal that they care about. So thank you so much, all three of you, for giving us the time and kind of making this amazing chat. And want to thank you for your time.
Cool. Thank you, Kartik.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Ciao.